This isn't my story, not directly, but it happened to a good friend of mine, Alex, about 5 years ago. He was a marine biologist, fresh out of his PhD, and completely brilliant, but also a bit socially awkward, always more comfortable with the silence of the deep than small talk. So, when he got a temporary research position at a restored remote lighthouse off the coast of Maine, he jumped at it. It sounded perfect for him, a chance to focus on his studies of coastal ecosystems, away from the constant hum of city life. The advertisement promised solitude, peace, and unparalleled access to the cold Atlantic. He told me the initial charm of the place was undeniable. The crashing waves against the rugged cliffs, the mournful cry of the foghorn, the endless expanse of the ocean stretching to the horizon. It was raw, beautiful, and utterly isolated. The only other inhabitants were the elderly lighthouse keeper, a gruff, weathered man named Silas, and his wife, Ilara. Silas was a man of few words, his face a roadmap of wind and sun. He spoke in clipped sentences, often about the sea, but sometimes about old currents, and things that drifted in with the fog, in a tone that made Alex's skin prickle. Ilara, his wife, was even stranger. She was almost entirely silent, moving through the cramped lighthouse with a strange, almost ethereal grace. Her eyes, Alex observed, seemed to reflect the light too intensely, like polished abalone shells, and held an unnerving, unblinking stillness. What truly struck Alex as odd was their routine. He never saw them eat, not once. They'd always decline his offers of shared meals. Instead, they seemed to sustain themselves on a thick, dark liquid they kept in a thermos, sipping it slowly, their faces impassive. And despite the biting cold that seeped into every crevice of the lighthouse, Alex never saw them shiver, never saw their breath plume in the frigid air. They seemed to radiate their own kind of cold. The initial charm of the place quickly faded, replaced by a pervasive sense of unease. Strange occurrences became more frequent. Whispers would float on the wind, distinct from the howl of the gales, carrying no discernible words but a haunting, sibilant sound. Objects in his small living quarters would sometimes shift position. A book moved from the shelf to the floor, a pencil rearranged on his desk. He'd brush it off as his imagination, the isolation playing tricks on him, but the feeling of being watched, constantly by something immense and unseen from the depths, became undeniable. He'd often look out at the churning gray waters, convinced he could see a flicker, a momentary gleam, just beneath the surface. Silas would sometimes appear silently behind him, startling him, and then just stare out at the sea, murmuring, "The currents are strong tonight." One particularly brutal night, a dense, suffocating fog rolled in, swallowing the lighthouse whole, plunging the world into an eerie, soundless white. The foghorn blared its mournful warning every few seconds, the sound muffled and distorted. Alex, unable to sleep, was in the lantern room, watching the beam cut through the swirling mist. Then he saw them. Through the swirling tendrils of the fog, luminous figures began to rise from the water. They were pale, almost translucent, glowing with an internal phosphorescent light. Their forms were indistinct at first, but as they drew closer, propelled by some unseen force towards the base of the lighthouse, Alex's blood ran cold. Their shapes were eerily familiar. They were tall, gaunt, with an unnerving, elongated quality. And their faces, when he could make them out through the swirling mist, bore a chilling resemblance to Silas and Ilara. The same unblinking eyes, the same vacant yet piercing stillness. He realized, with a sickening jolt, that the old couple never looked tired, never looked humanly warm. Their strange diet, their silence, their uncanny stillness. It wasn't old age or eccentricity. They were something else. They were keepers, not just of the light, but of whatever swam in the cold, black depths, whatever was drawn to the lighthouse's ancient beacon. And the luminous figures were either their kind or what they became. Panic seized him. He didn't know what they wanted, but the blank, beckoning gestures of the figures in the fog and the chilling realization about his hosts made him scramble. He fumbled for his small emergency radio, but the static was overwhelming. He knew he couldn't stay. He barely remembered descending the spiraling stairs past Silas and Alara, who were now standing silently in the main living area, their faces illuminated by the eerie glow seeping in from outside, their unblinking eyes fixed on him. They didn't move to stop him, just watched with an unnerving, knowing patience. Alex burst out of the lighthouse into the suffocating fog and the biting wind, stumbling blindly down the rocky path to the shore where his small research dinghy was moored. He fumbled with the engine, his hands numb, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt watched, not just by Silas and Alara, but by the cold, hungry depths that seemed to swirl around him. The metallic tang from earlier was stronger now, a sharp, briny stench. He somehow got the engine started, pulling away from the island, the lighthouse beam cutting through the fog, a mocking, guiding light for whatever horrors he was escaping. He just kept going, steering by instinct until the fog began to thin with the dawn. He ran the dinghy aground on a distant, populated beach, exhausted and incoherent. The official report blamed hypothermia and severe stress-induced delirium. When the Coast Guard went to check on the lighthouse, they found it empty. No Silas, no Alara, no sign of forced entry or struggle. Just an old, cold lighthouse, abandoned. The dinghy was confirmed to be Alex's. Alex never spoke of it publicly, not really. He left marine biology, found a quiet job far from any coast. He always kept warm, even in summer, bundled in layers, and he never, ever went near the ocean again. He still has this faraway look in his eyes sometimes, especially when there's a fog, like he's seeing something beyond the visible world, something immense and cold lurking just beneath the surface. He always insists that Silas and Alara weren't just old lighthouse keepers. They were the first line of welcome for whatever ancient, glowing things the sea chose to send ashore, drawn by the timeless beacon. And he knows, deep down, they're still out there, tending their cold light, waiting for the next ship or the next person to fall under the spell of the alpine silence. This story is a bit harder to verify, mostly because the official records are so sparse, and the few people who were actually there are either gone or refuse to speak about it. But I pieced it together from a series of old forum posts, hushed rumors in Alaskan small towns, and the frantic, fragmented messages of a tech entrepreneur named Marcus Thorne, who believed he could turn anything into a profit. Marcus, a visionary with more ambition than common sense, had sunk millions into a forgotten mining town deep in the Alaskan wilderness. It was called Oak Haven, a ghost town since the 1920s when the veins ran dry and most of the population just left. His idea was brilliant in a terrifying way. Transform it into a luxury, historically themed resort for extreme tourism. Guests would pay a fortune to experience the desolate beauty of Alaska, stay in restored miners' cabins, with heated floors naturally, and even explore safe parts of the old mines. The grand opening was set for the dead of winter, adding to the raw, isolated allure. I remember seeing the promotional videos, all stark, beautiful shots of snow-covered cabins under a vast, inky sky, juxtaposed with smiling, rugged adventurers. Marcus himself was front and center, promising an authentic experience, a connection to a bygone era. The first group of guests arrived by private charter plane, dropped off on a makeshift ice runway near the resort. They were a mix of wealthy thrill seekers and adventurous influencers. According to the few surviving accounts, the initial days were exactly as advertised. Crisp air, magnificent aurora displays, gourmet meals in the refurbished saloon. But almost immediately, strange things began to happen. Small things at first, dismissed as authenticity. Guests would find old, rusted mining tools, pickaxes, shovels, leaning against the doors of their cabins, even though they'd been thoroughly cleaned. Lights would flicker erratically in the deepest, supposedly sealed-off mine shafts visible from the resort grounds, even though there was no power down there. And sometimes, carried on the frigid wind, people swore they could hear faint, chilling echoes. Not just the wind, but human sounds. Picks striking rock, distant shouts, the mournful groan of straining timbers. These were things that couldn't be explained by the resort's sound system. The local staff were the most unsettling part. They were all descendants of the original Oakhaven townspeople, people who had apparently never left the valley, living in a small, separate community beyond the resort's view. They were quiet, stoic, and fiercely protective of certain areas of the town, particularly the entrances to the deeper mines and a crude, ancient-looking stone circle on a nearby ridge. They spoke in hushed tones of the hungry earth and the old ones resting beneath. Marcus, ever the entrepreneur, just laughed it off as quaint local superstition, something to add to the authentic mystique. He even encouraged the guests to ask about these local legends. Then the disappearances started. The first was a young influencer, a woman who had wandered off to get a unique photo opportunity by an old minecart. When she didn't return, Marcus organized a search. They found her camera, smashed, but no other sign. A few days later, a wealthy couple who had expressed interest in ghost hunting in one of the supposedly sealed shafts went missing. Again, no trace. No struggle, no blood, no footprints leading away into the snow. Only, in the places they were last seen, a strange, fine, mineral-laced dust, not snow, not soil, but something gritty and dark clinging to the rocks. Panic, cold and sharp as the Alaskan air, began to set in among the remaining guests. The staff, however, remained unnervingly calm. Their eyes, already deep set, seemed to recede further, becoming like dark, polished stones. They stopped talking about legends and started just watching. Their movements, always quiet, became even more deliberate, their faces devoid of emotion, even when a guest screamed after finding an old, tarnished mining helmet filled with that same strange dust in their bed. That's when people truly understood. This wasn't just a themed resort. This wasn't just a ghost town. It was inhabited by something ancient, something that resented the intrusion, something that had never truly left Oakhaven. The hungry earth wasn't a metaphor, it was real. And the historical experience was about to become a very real and very final part of their own history. The few who managed to escape, a couple of guests who overpowered one of the silent staff members at a snowmobile and drove blindly into the blizzard, recounted horrifying details. They spoke of seeing other guests, the ones who had disappeared, not as ghosts, but as gaunt, dust-covered figures, their eyes hollow, moving with the same unnerving stillness as the staff, silently toiling in the mouth of a newly opened mine shaft, seemingly pouring the fine dust into its maw. They weren't breathing, not really, just being, part of the silent, continuous process of feeding the earth. The official story? A catastrophic avalanche, followed by a fire consuming the resort. All guests and staff presumed lost. The sheer remoteness, the extreme weather, and the lack of communication infrastructure made it easy to explain away. The small local community nearby was largely ignored in official reports. Their strange, knowing silence was interpreted as grief or shock. But Marcus Thorne's last, frantic satellite phone message, relayed through a confused assistant before the line went dead, spoke of the ground consuming us, and them. They're everywhere, breathing it in, joining the work. The rescue teams found little but charred timbers and disturbed earth where Oakhaven had once stood, and an unusually fine, dark dust clinging to everything. And if you ask some of the old-timers in Alaska, they'll tell you Oakhaven was always hungry, and that some things, once opened, can never truly be closed again. They just keep working, silently, endlessly, feeding the Earth. This is a story I rarely tell, mostly because it sounds utterly unbelievable, even to me, and I worked with her. It concerns Dr. Lena Petrova, a glaciologist whose brilliance was matched only by her intensity. Lena was a woman of ice and fire, fiercely passionate about her work, but guarded, especially after a particularly bitter divorce that left her utterly heartbroken. It happened a few years ago, not long after my own experience with that resort in Alaska. Lena, seeking not just escape but a profound distraction, volunteered for a posting at the Chrysalis Station, an exclusive minimalist research facility literally carved into an ancient glacier in the remote Arctic. It was cutting-edge science, she told me in her last sane calls, unparalleled access to glacial phenomena, and, crucially for her, complete and utter solitude. The perfect place to bury herself in work and forget the world. The station itself was a marvel of human engineering. Sleek metallic pods embedded deep within the ice, accessed by long, glowing tunnels. The small team comprised a handful of other dedicated scientists and an even smaller group of silent, taciturn support staff. In Lena's early dispatches, she spoke of the breathtaking beauty, the endless white, and the profound silence that was only occasionally broken by the eerie creaks and groans of the moving glacier. She was focused, driven, exactly what she'd wanted. But then her messages started to change. The scientific observations became interspersed with more personal, unsettling details. She began to mention an unnatural cold radiating from the ice itself, a chill that seeped into her bones even within the heated pods. It was a cold that felt alive, almost sentient. And the glacier, she wrote, hums. Not an audible sound, but a low, resonant frequency that vibrated through the ice, through the station, and, she believed, through her very body. Her dreams grew vivid, disturbingly so. She described being trapped within the glacier's depths, crushed by its immense weight, yet feeling no pain, only an overwhelming sense of ancient memory flooding her mind. She'd wake up disoriented, the dreams feeling more real than the stark reality of the station. More worryingly, the other scientists began to change. They grew increasingly withdrawn, their conversations dwindling to monosyllables. Their skin, Lena observed, took on an unnatural pallor, a translucent quality, and their movements became stiff, almost brittle, as if the cold had seeped into their joints. Their eyes, once bright with scientific curiosity, became distant, glazed, fixed on something unseen. They didn't seem to shiver anymore, despite the station's cooling temperature, and their breaths were barely visible puffs of vapor. They just were. Lena, ever the meticulous scientist, started exploring the oldest, deepest sections of the glacier, the parts that were hundreds of thousands of years old. And there, carved into the inner walls of the ice, she found them. Peculiar markings. They weren't natural formations. They were complex, almost glyph-like patterns that seemed to shift and subtly reform when she looked away and then back again. They weren't drawn on the ice. They were part of it, like veins in a living thing. It was then that the horrifying realization solidified in her mind. The glacier wasn't just a physical entity. It was alive. It was conscious. And it was absorbing. It was slowly claiming everyone within its icy embrace, drawing them into its ancient crystalline memory, making them a part of itself. The unnatural cold, the hum, the dreams, the changing appearance of her colleagues. They were all symptoms of this slow, relentless absorption. The glacier was hungry, not for flesh and blood, but for consciousness, for memory, for the living warmth of humanity. Her last frantic call to me was garbled, punctuated by raw static and the unnerving creak of ice. "It's not just holding them, Mark," she'd shrieked, her voice thin with terror. "It's becoming them, their memories. It's all there, and it's pulling me in." She spoke of seeing her colleagues, unmoving, pressed against the ice walls, their faces frozen in expressions of serene acceptance, their bodies slowly becoming one with the glacier, their eyes like chips of ancient ice. The reconnection wasn't to self, it was to the cold, vast consciousness of the glacier itself. I immediately raised the alarm. It took days to organize a recovery team given the station's extreme remoteness and the worsening Arctic weather. When they finally reached Chrysalis Station, they found it intact, but utterly deserted. All equipment was powered down, everything neatly in place, as if the occupants had simply stepped out. There were no signs of struggle, no bodies, no trace of Lena or her colleagues. Just in profound, unsettling silence. The official explanation was equipment failure leading to the team evacuating on foot during a severe blizzard, presumed lost. But no distress signals were sent. No footprints were found leading away from the station that weren't the recovery teams. And the station's emergency supplies were all untouched. Years later, I still think about Lena. Sometimes when the winter air is particularly sharp, I feel that unnatural cold she described. And I remember her last words, the desperation in her voice, describing how the glacier slowly absorbed everything. I look at old photographs of her, and I see a flicker of that same unnerving stillness in her eyes that she described in her colleagues. I can't shake the feeling that Lena Petrova, the brilliant glaciologist, didn't just get lost in the Arctic. She became a part of it. And somewhere, deep within that ancient ice, her consciousness, along with all the others, might still be humming, a silent, frozen whisper in the vast, unfeeling memory of the glacier's embrace.